Hi, fellas. Y'all about to get that thing filmed?
Are you about to get that thing filmed? George Wallace asked Thursday morning. You are about to see what Governor Wallace was asking about. A candid film report of this man and some of those who support him.
And a good, loyal American, may I present Governor Wallace to you.
This is a people's movement. It doesn't make any difference whether the major politicians are going to support you or not. If they don't support us in this movement to take back our government and give it to us and let us run our own institutions, those who stand in the way are liable to get run over by you people who are in this auditorium here tonight.
If he gets on the ballot, he's going to stir up something, I'll guarantee you. After you hear him talk, I think you'll agree with me. Columbus Stockade Blues, fellas, we're going to get country now. We're going to get town hall party.
George Wallace says this is a people's movement, and his singing supporter tells us that George Wallace is going to stir something up. Tonight, we're going to try to see this country as George Wallace sees it. George Wallace's America is out there everywhere, beyond news clips of pickets and demonstrations, in the quieter, simpler world of his Americans, whose political voice to Wallace is mathematically powerful.
In California, and the other two parties got 33 apiece, then we would win the electoral vote of California. And if 4 or more parties run, you could mathematically win on 26% of the vote. And so that has led Senator Dirksen to say the other day that because of this third party movement that might spring up, we may have to change the electoral system before next year. So at least you and me have got them talking about changing the Constitution already. It's already had that much force and effect and impact upon the leaders of our two national parties today.
The governor of Alabama lives in this house in Montgomery, the state capital and former capital of the Confederate States of America. The former governor of the state is George Wallace, 48 years old, who by law could not succeed himself in 1966, the year his wife, Lurleen, was elected governor. It was from the Capitol here in Montgomery in the summer of 1963 that George Wallace left for the University of Alabama to stand in the schoolhouse door against federal marshals who had come to enforce a court order for integration. Wallace stood, the marshals won, but Wallace has been a national figure ever since.
What you can do, exactly what to do now, other than maybe let them tell you, but it's bad, people of all races, for the government to take over and say, you must sell your property to somebody you don't want to sell it to, or rent your property to someone you don't want to rent it to. And in Alabama, we feel that way. Well, in California, they do. In fact, it's better known there how they feel than in Alabama. We've never voted on the matter at the polls in this state, but the Supreme Court of our country comes along and says that the people of California did not have a right to vote on that matter. In other words, the liberals, the pseudo-intellectuals, say the people. If it's anybody that's always talking about the people, it's intellectual. Yet when the people voted a certain way in California because it didn't conform to the way the pseudo-intellectual and the judges thought they ought to vote, they of course said it's illegal. Well, when is it illegal for people to determine property rights by a vote at the polls? After all, the Constitution of our country and of states are products of the people. The people come first. That's the source of all power.
God give us men. The former governor of the state of Alabama, and God willing, the next president of the United States, Mr. George C. Wallace.
My wife asked the legislature to pass a law to let the parents vote on who taught their children, even regarding race, and 99.4% of people of both races voted that they wanted teachers of their own race. That's the parents, white and black, voting. And you know, they filed an injunction and enjoined the operation of the law, and the Justice Department is arguing that the parents of Alabama have no constitutional right to have anything to do with voting on who teaches their children. However cumbersome it might be, however inconvenient it might be, is not the question. The question is, does the people of Oregon, through their legislature, have a right to let you vote on school teachers if they see fit? But the government of our country argues that a mother and father cannot choose their teachers, but the federal judge is the only one that can choose teachers for the children of our state. And they haven't rendered a decision yet because they've got it in what they call the bosom of the court. And they are now considering the matter within the bosom of the court. And these judges, in my judgment, are trying to think up of some way, because I say quite frankly, in my judgment, they prejudged the case already. I think they've already decided before they heard the evidence of the teachers that they were going to rule against it.
Local people, local doctors and lawyers and businessmen in little towns in South Carolina should have a little bit more say-so about what type of economic and sociological ideas that are being taught to their children. I think that they have a right to continue the same type culture that they believe in and they love so much. And of course, this is, I know, completely frowned upon by other people in other sections, and people even here in this state, some feel differently. But I think that people have a right to have their children educated in a way that they know is best for them, and in a way that will not destroy the culture as they know it.
I'd like to see this country return to law and order so I can be sure that my children are safe to walk the streets, and that my children can go to the schools and have the kind of teachers that I think they should, that I want them to, rather than the kind of teachers, the kind of schools that somebody up in Washington says they should go to. And I think Governor Wallace can give us this kind of government more than anyone else.
But we have a lot of critics today, and they don't dare argue logically. They cannot argue logically with you and me, because when we say, let the people of California, let the people of South Carolina, let the people of Alabama decide those matters domestic and local, they can't argue with you, because there's no argument against it. It's constitutional and it's right. So they got to say we are bigots. They got to say we are hate mongers. They got to say we are fascists. Well, of course, I'm not a bigot, nor a fascist, nor a hate monger, and I'm not a warmonger. I am one who believes in the right of local people to determine some things for themselves.
George Wallace's appeal is not the narrow appeal of a mere racist demagogue, although that, to a large extent, is the root and the secret of it. George Wallace's basic appeal, however, is to something that I would call the instinctive wisdom of a good many Americans. The instinctive wisdom best exemplified in such phrases as kill or be killed, look out for oneself first. If no one else looks out for you, you'll have to look out for yourself. This kind of wisdom. And it means that George Wallace, propounding this kind of wisdom with all the force and the sincerity and the considerable wit, the considerable passion that he has about it, makes a very strong appeal to people who feel quite the same way that he does about things.
I like to point out that pseudo-intellectuals, a lot of them on the Supreme Court, theoreticians that write out theory. I'm talking about the editor of the New York Times who said Castro was a good man and helped bring him to power, along with college professors at many of the colleges. Princeton was one where a number of professors had Castro there because he was a great savior of the common people in Cuba. But the policemen at Princeton told me they knew that Castro was a communist for talking with him, but not the pseudo-intellectual who had him there. So what I'm saying is that these folks are always mistaken about things, and they write the guidelines for the man who isn't mistaken a lot of times. So if there's any guideline writing that ought to be done, it ought to be done by the oil worker and the steel worker and the cab driver. He ought to write the guideline for the pseudo-intellectual instead of the pseudo-intellectual writing the guidelines for him.
What I've explained is not explained and is not repeated, and the people are not informed on what they've lost in the way of the right of self-government. They can feel it. They can feel it. They know there's something wrong. They know that Washington is taken over. And frankly, every detail that Washington can interfere. The only ambition of the chief executive in his political organization called the national government is for votes for re-election. And They place more importance on the block vote than on government, than on peace and good order, than on law enforcement and observance and respect for the laws. Johnson is just a political pervert, and he has perverted our government to outlawry. And he's brought about the destruction of our cities by the very people that he's encouraged.
A farm near Mayville, Wisconsin, a state that gave George Wallace 34% of its votes in the 1964 primary.
We like to feel that the liberals are the extremists as far as being on the left side, because they want total government control, and anarchy is the extreme on the right side where they want no government, and we're right in the middle where we want government, good, strong, limited government. So really a conservative follows the middle of the road. I don't know if I'm very good at convincing anyone why they should vote for Wallace. If anyone is really interested, and I'm pretty sure that most American people are interested in preserving this country of ours, then they would certainly vote for Mr. Wallace rather than voting for some other liberal candidate, which either the Democrats or the Republicans are going to offer a liberal candidate who's going to give away our money and give away our government and give away everything else because they're all good guys. And of course, Mr. Wallace is one of the bad guys. You know, he wants to support or preserve this country, which no good high official really wants to do. They want to be popular in the world.
Well, I think that the Negro, no doubt about it, has got out of hand. And I think Wallace will enforce law and order. And this is one thing that the people are concerned about. Now, there's no doubt about it that they have burnt down Detroit. They've burnt down the east side over here. And anybody that would say that this is not a problem would be naive. Well, I think the biggest difference that I would be concerned with and I would hope to see is the enforcement of law and order, turning the power of enforcement back over to the individual states, because it's become a time now in all these cities that it's dangerous for people even to leave the doors unlocked. You have to lock your doors.
We've always had revolutionists in this country. We had revolutions in this country after an anarchist in 1917. And where they blew up factories and all that kind of, what did they do? They crushed them and put them in jail and put them in the electric chair where people were killed and crushed them, which is the way it ought to have been done. They got their civil rights. They were tried and had jury. They were guilty. But now you burn a town down and they sit down and say, if you won't do it again, we will pass some law. We'll be lenient. You've got to enforce the law. And people are tired and sick of anarchists going out here and saying we had a reason to seriously affect the internal security of this country. And you can that could and they know it. It could affect the external security of this country. This country could fall and become a fifth-rate power by anarchy in the large cities of this nation, because law enforcement personnel are not allowed to enforce the law.
Wallace will appeal very strongly in some of the big industrial states where there is a large vote from low economic groups, from working class people who feel themselves directly threatened on the one hand by the Negro's slow emergence from his old position of being last on the ladder, and who feel themselves on the other hand abused somehow because they see the preponderance of welfare benefits going to the Negro. They see a great many things being done for the Negro. After all, they themselves are not that much higher on the economic scale than the Negro is. And they wonder to themselves, why should I have to work 8, 10, 12 hours a day merely to keep my head above water when so often it seems that the Negro merely draws his welfare payment? This isn't at all a true perspective, but in any case, it's the way many people think. And George Wallace will be thinking the same way and saying the same things.
You take a picture of Wallace, and this picture the guy gave me, you can see character in his eyes. You know, he's I don't get fooled too much on people anyway. You know, I can pretty well read a person. Yeah, I put him in sort of the category of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Not Franklin, but Theodore.
Yeah.
And he's got a little spunk to him, a little backbone, you know. That's what the American people need.
Not without reason that Mrs. Wallace has said of George Wallace that the reason he is so powerful and so well regarded in Alabama and elsewhere is because that when they see him on a television program, on Meet the Press or somewhere else, he says what they wish they had the opportunity to say from the same kind of forum. Because it is a broad-gauged appeal, I think he's the most dangerous, or if that's the way you feel, the most hopeful third-party candidate in at least since 1924 when La Follette ran.
Mr. Khrushchev spoke to him, and he got the traditional certificate. And Mr. Castro spoke to him, and they gave it to him. And you know the reason they gave for not giving me the certificate? They said, we don't like Governor Wallace's tactics, but I suppose they liked Khrushchev and Castro. And you know what I told the National Press Club? As far as I was concerned, they could take that certificate, and they knew what they could do with it. And I want to say in conclusion that you're doing a magnificent job. And I've said many times that if the police in this country could just run it for about 2 years, then we could walk in the parks and on the streets in safety, and you are doing a magnificent job. Thank you very much. And we know that today, if someone molests you on the street, the molester is out of jail before you get in the hospital, and on Monday, they don't try the criminal, they try the policeman. And I say to you that we ought to be very proud of the policeman. So the man on the street knows things that these folks don't know that are laying down our guidelines. And so I say that every cab driver, because I was one, in Alabama knew by instinct that old Castro was a communist by just looking at him.
Well, I think the biggest difference that I would be concerned with and I would hope to see is the enforcement of law and order, turning the power of enforcement back over to the individual states. Because it's become a time now in all these cities that it's dangerous for people to even leave the doors unlocked. You have to lock your doors.
On a nationwide basis, I would say that the appeal, the skill, the forcefulness, the daring, and the persistence of George Wallace is going to make him a very formidable third-party candidate, one who might carry several states, who might carry as much as 15% of the popular vote, who might indeed be the decisive factor in the 1968 presidential election.
The Negro and white citizen of this state and the overwhelming majority of Negro and whites in the country are against the breakdown of law and order. And so when you ask me the question, and others do, you say, does that have racial overtones? When has it gotten to be in this country that when you talk about law and order, it has racial overtones?
Don't you think it does?
It has to this extent that a number of Negroes, a small minority of the Negro citizens, were involved in rioting and looting. But the overwhelming majority of the Negro citizens of this country are against that as much as you and me. And I would say that actually it doesn't have racial overtones insofar as I am concerned. It has criminality overtones.
All right. Well, let me just...
I'm talking about the pseudo-intellectual. I'm not talking about the true intellectual that I consider a true intellectual, and that's a matter of judgment, because there are some who think and say that I'm a demagogue. Some writers say that, because I say those writers are writing demagogues. The true intellectual is a man who has some wisdom and knowledge.
Well, Governor...
the pseudo-intellectual is a man who mimics what other people write, and he memorizes it, and he has some knowledge. And then he doesn't have much common sense. I'm not against intellectuals at all. I have no suspicion of intellectuals. I'm talking about the man that I judge as a pseudo-intellectual, a false intellectual. Whether that's an apt description for them or apt description to you, I'm not sure. And if you want to know the definition of what I'm talking about, a pseudo-intellectual, I'm talking about one, for instance, who marches in the streets and assaults the Pentagon.
Could you name one?
No, I can't name any, but I read some of them. If I'd have known you was going to ask that question, yes, I could have given you the names. They had names in the paper of different professors. I was at Dartmouth one night speaking, and a junior college professor led the charge down the aisle saying, kill him, kill him. I don't remember his name, but he was a junior college professor, and his name's been in the paper. I'm talking about the professor at Rutgers that advocated communist victory and an impassioned plea. I long for communist victory. I'm talking about the one at Berkeley that made a speech that went all over the world that let us raise a freedom brigade to go fight the American imperialist soldiers. I call that a pseudo-intellectual.
All right.
Now, since you've asked me that question, I'd be glad to get you the names of some of these people. I don't remember the names and didn't know you were going to ask me. But they have marched in the streets. They marched right here in Alabama in the Selma parade and stood up in front of our Capitol and applauded everything this different people said, like Joan, the singer that said she wouldn't sing for the American truth, but she'd sing for the Viet. I call that a group, and 3 of them from the University of Alabama marched in the parade.
George Wallace won anywhere from 25 to 43% of the vote in 1964 in primaries in Maryland, Wisconsin, and Indiana. And I think it can be taken for granted that he will take a large percentage, not that large, in states of that kind, in many states of that kind, in 1968. Now, the significance of this is not that George Wallace can be expected to win the presidency. It's not that he can be, in my view, expected to win enough electoral votes to throw the election into the House of Representatives, although he himself talks of that prospect. But the significance is that in many states that will be closely contested between President Johnson and a Republican challenger. Wallace might take anywhere from 10 to 15, even in some cases as high as 20% of the vote right off the top.